I think that, when we start to talk about sexual offense behaviors, the general public always goes to this is just a horrible person.
Right.
This is just a bad person. And while there's no doubt the person has engaged in really bad behaviors, very inappropriate behaviors, I always go back to look at what is underneath all of that. What is this person really trying to, what needs are they trying to meet in a very inappropriate way?
Right.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We're back today with, as usual, our host, Dr. Greg Miller. And once again, we've been very fortunate to get Elizabeth Griffin from the staff here at Faithful and True. She is our what's that? We have a great title for you. What?
Clinical consultant.
Clinical consultant.
Yeah.
Yes, it's very important, very prestigious, and she's in high demand. Anyway, we're really thrilled to have Elizabeth back with us today, and we're going to continue a conversation we started on our last podcast.
Yep. And what we're going to be talking about is, for those of you who've been listening to the last several podcasts, we've been talking about loneliness. And we just started by talking about the reality of loneliness that a lot of people experience, the importance of engaging community. Last time we talked about loneliness and the way that it can pull us into technology. Well, today we want to talk about specifically the relationship between loneliness and offending behaviors. And we are very thankful, Elizabeth, that you are here, because this is something that has been a part of your professional career. You've done research, you understand. And one of the things that is challenging is what's just true is there are people who act out sexually that because of their choices, it is an offending behavior. Many of them experience the legal consequences of that. And it is incredibly challenging and difficult. And we are thankful to have someone like you that can help us and support us as we navigate this. And so we want to talk about what does it look like when there are offending behaviors and what the relationship of loneliness or the impact of loneliness might have had on the fact to engage offending behaviors.
So when we talk about offending behaviors, maybe we should define kind of what that is.
Yes.
I kind of think of offending behaviors as non-contact offending behaviors versus contact offending behaviors. So non-contact would maybe be things like exhibitionism or voyeurism, frottage, which is when people will intentionally rub up against people, maybe at a concert or on a subway. They make it seem unintentional, but it's intentional. Other non-contact behaviors would be some of the online sexual offense behaviors, like viewing child sexual abuse images or talking with minors and soliciting minors for sexual pictures. And then contact offense behavior would be engaging in some type of sexual activity with a minor or with a vulnerable adult, or even an adult who maybe isn't vulnerable, using force using force or coercion to have someone engage in a sexual activity with you.
Right. I think another offending behavior is when a person's position or role is used. So
Yes.
if I'm a supervisor and
Authority.
I move towards someone
Yes.
sexually that I supervise, or a clinician to a client,
Yes.
any of those types of things too, where
Sexual harassment
Right.
kinds of things.
there's a
Yes.
positional power that is engaged in it. And what can be confusing for people is their sense of, if it's one adult with another adult, that it was consensual. But the factor is that this role that person had in the person's life was an active agent in the experience and can't be dismissed.
Correct.
And so one of the things to understand is what we're talking about is crossing a significant line, moving towards someone or something where it is in some way a place of power. I have power, either I want power or I do have power, and I'm trying to move towards someone in a sexual way in order for some sort of sexual gratification. The big thing is, and there's not an invitation. It's not mutual. It's not reciprocal. It's not consensual in the way that everybody is moving towards this as an equal.
As an equal, because children aren't able to give consent. Vulnerable adults are not. Or if it is an adult who maybe gave consent at one time, they've now decided that this isn't what they want, not something that they would enjoy, and yet the person continues to move toward them despite those objections.
Right. And again, that positional power where I'm a doctor and this is a patient. In some cases, the patient may even have initiated. The problem is I cannot separate myself from the role, so the person is initiating with the role, not with the person. And so we do work with men that's part of their story, where there was some sort of positional aspect to the sexual experience.
It was inherent power in your position.
Yeah, that's a great way to say it.
Yeah.
So we're talking about this idea of loneliness. And one of the things that is true is if I'm moving from this place and it's an offending behavior, there is a level of desperation that I think is implied. There's an additional motivation. And part of that may be an insecurity, a fear of rejection, the not believing that I'm going to be accepted. And so the more desperate I am, the more willing I am to cross legal and appropriate barriers in order to be sexual or express my sexuality.
I think that, when we start to talk about sexual offense behaviors, the general public always goes to, this is just a horrible person.
Right.
This is just a bad person. And while there's no doubt the person has engaged in really bad behaviors, very inappropriate behaviors, I always go back to look at what is underneath all of that. What is this person really trying to, what needs are they trying to meet in a very inappropriate way?
Right.
And so, research has definitely shown that one of the pathways to sexual offense behavior is intimacy deficits and social skills deficits and lack of community, that I don't know how to connect appropriately. I'm so desperate for that then I engage in very inappropriate ways. Or I love the 7 desires that I always say that when it's all said and done, that people who engage in offense behavior are looking to get their 7 desires met. They have, it's even more that they have a desperate need to get them met, and they have no understanding of appropriate ways to do that around sexuality.
Right. And they start with even a deficit in the desire itself. So if I believe I'm unchoosable, then I'm going to manufacture opportunities where I can be chosen, even if the consequence is significant.
Or force someone to choose.
I'm going to impose myself on someone.
Right.
And the same thing with, if I don't believe I'm includable, then I'm going to force myself, impose myself on someone. Or I'm going to choose a situation where my role or my power gives me access to someone that, to a peer or to someone with mutual power, I would not believe I would have access to. And so I do think, and this is so complicated because we walk a line, we never in any way validate or justify someone's behavior or choice. So there isn't an excuse, there's not a rationalization that gives permission for these things to happen. And we also believe that the person who's participating in it is coming out of their own pain and chaos, and that pain and chaos needs to be understood and acknowledged.
And even more than understood and acknowledged, what I do in my world of treatment for people who've committed sex offenses, I want to make sure they never engage in this behavior again. That is my one role in treatment, to make sure this doesn't ever happen again. And so in order to make sure it never happens again, we have to understand where the behavior originates.
Right.
I can say, don't do this again.
Right.
And for some people, maybe that would be enough. But for most people, unless they address that underlying issue, then they're at risk for engaging in the behavior again.
Right.
So I think it's even more that we need to understand is more that in order to make sure the behavior doesn't, it's prevention. In order to make sure the behavior doesn't happen again, we need to understand why this person engaged in the behavior.
Yeah. As we talk about addiction, we talk about this idea that we're trying to meet a legitimate need in a very illegitimate way. And these offending behaviors are incredibly destructive and painful for the victims of that.
Yes.
So I must be driven by a very strong legitimate need if I'm willing to cross all these boundaries and barriers in order to hurt people through my sexual choices. It's important that we get in there and understand what is that legitimate need that is so absent in being met that they're willing to do these inappropriate things to do it. And that's where sometimes it is about loneliness. It is about insecurities. It is about fear that apart from these coerced or manufactured opportunities or these places of secrecy that I can go to, outside of that, I don't have a belief that connection is possible for me. And so I look for these false ways to create connection, these destructive ways to create connection in order to rescue me from my loneliness and my fears and my insecurities.
And, if you think about it, because of our attitude toward people who commit sexual offense behaviors, oftentimes they have difficulty finding places to connect after they've committed a sexual offense. So when I'm trying to find connection and community, it becomes the one thing that they need more than anything. It becomes really difficult to find safe places for individuals to connect. So it can kind of become a vicious cycle.
Right.
Because people don't want people who've been convicted of sex offenses to be in their faith communities. Right. They don't want them to live in their neighborhoods. They don't want them to go to certain events. And so it becomes really difficult for that individual to then find exactly what they need to prevent this from happening again.
I said this earlier, but I do believe that you are a gift to our team. I tell you that. Because we get these calls. In fact, there was a call that I got from a faith community. It was a pastor someone from their congregation was being released from prison because of sexual offending behaviors. And they wanted to come back and participate in the church. And again, as you can imagine, there were all these reactions to the fact that this person who had been in jail for this offense was wanting to come back to the church. Well, what we believe as the Christian community is the church is a good place for them to be. What we also believe is that community is what is essential, and we also want the community to be wise and to be safe. And so walking that fine line of acceptance and wisdom and safety. And one of the things that we want the people who have had offending behaviors and have experienced the consequences of that is one of the consequences of that is some ongoing suspicion. And it does take some time to be seen as someone who can be safe. What we absolutely believe is someone who's willing to do the work of recovery and healing and transformation can show up as a safe presence, because we don't believe you are defined by your behaviors. Right. I am not my choices. My value, my identity come from who God is and who God created me to be, and my choices don't change that. And there are consequences to my choices.
There will always be extra accountability in an individual who has a history of sex offending behavior, and that's appropriate. And it can be done with grace. It can be done with community. It is complicated. It takes extra work on everyone's part, but I all the time see success stories for people who are willing to hang in there, both with the person who committed the sexual offense and the person who committed the sexual offense.
Right.
There's a lot of work to be done on both sides.
Right. And you kind of alluded to this, but there is a continuum of offending behaviors.
Yes.
And so it's important that we understand the continuum. It's so easy when we hear of a story just to kind of lump them all together as if everybody is the same. And one of the best gifts we can give someone is to hear their story and see where they may be on the continuum. And what's also true is there's a continuum of consequences. And that's one of the things that you and I have talked about a lot, is trying to identify and help someone to understand what are valid consequences given what the person has done. I would also think that there is a continuum of possible recovery, and discerning, who is a great candidate for recovery, and like you said, with the right support, is willing to and able to walk away from an offending behavior and never do it again, versus that person that might have a greater possibility of a greater vulnerability to do it again. What, in your experience, what are some of the factors, what do you see, what are you aware of that help identify where somebody might be on that continuum?
Wow. I can give you an answer, and it's a really complicated 8-hour long conversation.
Okay.
But I would say that you're right. It is a process to determine where people are on that continuum. Because everyone, I believe, most everyone that I have ever worked with who committed sex offense behavior wants to believe that they will never do this again.
Right.
And obviously there are people with vulnerabilities that would perhaps indicate that they are more likely to do this again. So issues with drugs and alcohol. If you cannot be sober, we all know that anyone under the influence of drugs or alcohol, we're more likely to make poor decisions.
Right.
So, that's just kind of like a duh.
Yeah.
If you can't stay sober, that's concerning. If you're someone who has a long-term history of not living by the rules, like you from the time, and maybe this is because of a lot of stuff that happened in your childhood, but from the time you were an adolescent, you couldn't follow the rules and you have trouble with authority. You have trouble setting boundaries of any kind for yourself. We know the road may be more difficult for you.
Would you even say a factor is, and you don't believe the rules are for you?
For you, right. You don't believe that the rules apply to you.
Yeah.
People who have really sexually compulsive, or a long history of sex addiction that they've never been able to get under control. So it's not even just one of these factors,
right.
But when you start to combine some factors together, people who are young have more difficulty, because we know if you're young, you're more impulsive. If you're 60, we know that once you get older and you're less impulsive and you have better common sense,
right.
that you're less likely to engage in this behavior. A 21-year-old, just by the fact that they're 21 years old, we're
right.
more concerned about. Doesn't mean that they will. These are not any factors, but you take a 21-year-old and you place them online and they're using drugs and alcohol. It is a very bad
right.
combination.
Yeah.
And so there are lots of different factors that people need to look at. This is why I always say to faith communities, families, you can't figure this out alone.
Absolutely.
You always need professional help to figure out what kind of accountability does this person need now that they're living with me, now that they're back in a faith community, now that they're a friend of mine. What kind of accountability do they need? And a professional to help guide us about what that looks like at each stage of the process.
One of the principles, I think, of wisdom is if we expect somebody to do something that they cannot do for themselves, we've set everybody up to fail.
Yes.
And so part of the wisdom is knowing what, if somebody can do it, that they do it.
Right.
If they can't do it, then we do create the boundaries, the guidelines, the supervision, the accountability that supports them in that. And that's, I know that sometimes the the Christian community can struggle because there's this emphasis on grace, they're forgiven, we're going to start all over, let the past be the past, versus actually let's be informed by the past. And grace isn't a free-for-all, it's an acknowledgement of, yes, there is hope, yes, there is forgiveness, yes, there is a way forward, and we want to set people up to be successful.
Faith communities as a whole, not every faith community, tends to be too permissive and do nothing, or not accepting at all.
Right. Yes.
They either go to one or the other extreme, and neither is helpful.
Right.
Because people need accountability. You can still provide grace and community and acceptance with accountability.
Yeah. Part of this idea of going to the extremes, we typically go to the extremes in order to create safety. Mm-hmm. Either we're just going to welcome them back and not do anything, or we're going to exclude them completely and not do anything. That feels safer than we're going to try to navigate the complexity of welcoming somebody back that does have a complex history. And I remember the conversation that we had with the pastor, and so much of it was about, educating the congregation about these issues, creating safety and boundaries and parameters for the person. But it's back to that idea of community, that if loneliness is a factor and community is what is necessary for healing, what are the safe ways that we can provide community for someone who is trying to live differently, understand their behaviors, and has a great, is in that range of a great possibility of recovery and never doing it again.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You said it better than I could ever say it.
He does that all the time.
I know.
I do think that it's interesting. We've talked about doing a podcast around this for a while, and even we are hesitant because of the complexity. And it's not because this issue is too much or the person who's done it is too much. Sometimes it's simply too much to capture in a 30-minute podcast.
It is very complicated. And when I've worked with churches, it is a very long process. And there are so many feelings and emotions from every side that you need to hear and respect. And then to set up a scenario that everyone can feel good about, that the person can feel like they're accepted, but there's accountability, because the stakes are high. Mm-hmm. If we don't do this right, I think this is why a lot of people just go, it can't be done. Because if this person were to reoffend, no one wants that scenario. Right. Those are high stakes. And so I think then it's a very complicated process that faith communities, friends are often unwilling to even, take with someone that they were close friends with. Right. Churches are unwilling. And so then we're back to the loneliness piece for that individual who really does need community in order to give, to assure that they aren't going to do this again.
Well, and, we talk about in previous podcasts that the role of community is to be the expression of grace. And so we desperately need community because it's in that space where we experience God's grace. And we also need community in order to shed shame. Mm-hmm. So that person in isolation, they're not experiencing God's grace and they're not shedding their shame, which we know that shame is a driving factor. And so it is this complex thing where we step into this space as God's presence being wise. One other thing that I think it's important is, and we also want to acknowledge that if there's been an offending behavior, there has been a victim.
Yes.
And it's so important to acknowledge the victims that are in this complexity. Mm-hmm. And, one of the things that we talked about when we were talking to this pastor was in his church will be victims of sexual abuse and of offending behaviors. And it makes perfect sense that those men and women are going to have reactions if you begin to include someone, especially if they've not done their own work and haven't experienced healing yet, or they're still living in secrecy. And so that's part of the dynamic. It's not just acknowledging the offender and his or her need for support, but it's also, if we're going to pursue this, everyone who has been offended and hurt by behavior who have been violated, they also are going to need support.
Right.
I do get overwhelmed when we talk about these things because I go, how can this be done? And yet you're left with, we must trust that God is big enough. We must trust that grace is enough and that there is space for the complexity. In God's grace, there's space for the person who has offended, and there is healing for the person that has been violated.
And I think also when people in faith-based communities, in any communities who are engaging in offending behavior that no one knows about, and they see how it's being handled with the person that it is known about, then it keeps them living in shame and secrecy. Because what we know is that with technology, people are engaging more and more in sexual offense behavior, whether that is talking to someone under 18, requesting sexual photos, talking sexually with them, or viewing child sexual abuse images. We know that people who struggle with sex addiction have often gone down that rabbit hole of seeing those images. And yet it's very difficult for them to come forward and say, I need help with this.
Right.
Because they look around and see how people are treated once they do come forward.
Yeah. And they also are aware of the significant consequences
of the behavior.
So, yes, and finding the courage to name what is going on. Many times what I see is the men who are able to name what they're doing in secrecy, it's because they already feel connected to a safe community. And they have one person that they can share it with. And then by sharing it with that one person, it expands and they feel supported. The more isolated I am in my behavior and the more alone I am in my life, the more challenging it is to find the courage to speak it out loud.
Definitely. And it does take a lot of courage.
Absolutely.
Well, once again, thank you so much for being with us today,
Thank you.
Elizabeth. You're fantastic and powerful message today. It's not an easy subject for us to be discussing, and I know that we have a lot of viewers and listeners out there that will benefit greatly from this conversation today. So we thank you for that. If you have listened to this message today and realized that your life has been impacted and that you need the help that we provide here at Faithful and True, we invite you to visit our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find lots of resources, lots of free resources, over 400 podcasts, much like this one, under a wide variety of subjects, as well as the resources of the books by Mark and Debbie Laaser that are available in our store. We also have all of the information and registration capabilities for our intensive 3-day workshops. Every month we do the Men's Journey Workshop here at Faithful and True. And the information about that, there's a podcast video for you to be able to view that really answers, I think, the basic questions that most men have about the Men's Journey Workshop, as well as then the invitation to register for any of the upcoming monthly Men's Journey workshops. We also do about 3 times a year, we do for the spouses, we do the Women's Journey Workshop, and all that information and registration is there as well. As well as the 2 Couples Journey Workshop. We've added a new one, Couples Journey Workshop 1, and then the long-standing Couples Journey Workshop 2. Information about those events are all on the website, and we invite you to check those out. In the meantime, thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us. Your support and loyalty is much appreciated. We hope that this coming week will be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.